roof every Saturday. But yes, do sit down and tell me about yourselves. So how long were you here for, I wonder?
Yeah, for 18 days visit.
Oh, that's not long.
Yeah. So we live in India,
Yes.
in southern part of India.
Kerala, where Carey didn't
Kerala,
go.
yeah. And for the last 32 years, I preach the word of God in different places in India,
Yes.
and especially to the northeastern part of India.
Right.
Yeah.
So you know that patch.
Yeah.
Carey's patch.
Yeah.
Yes.
And there is a border state called Arunachal Pradesh in India.
Yes.
So there the Chinese race people are living. So they are Indians, but their race is Chinese.
Oh, with China. I
Yeah.
didn't realise that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we got an opportunity to go to that place as missionaries.
Right.
And
you're both missionaries, are you?
Yeah.
Yes.
So we went there and we helped the churches in those places.
Yes.
So still we are doing that.
Yes.
That's
okay.
it.
And so they're keeping you busy here as well.
Yeah,
telling
that's
you
right.
all about it.
That's right.
Yes. Well, if you lived in Carey's day, you would be just a missionary wife. And I always think that Hannah Marshman, who was part of the Serampore community, she was the most wonderful woman, but she was never called a missionary. It was always a missionary's wife, but she did far more than some of the men. And when they had the community in Serampore, and I guess you know Serampore, do you?
Yes.
Yes. When she was when they went there to join Carey, she mothered the community really, and she looked after all the catering to start with and all the workmen, and she opened boarding schools to earn money for the work of the mission, and she pioneered female education for women at the same time. And she did all the troubleshooting when the men got into trouble. She would try to smooth things over with the authorities and so on. She even came back to this country once when there was a misunderstanding between the mission and Serampore. So she was an amazing woman. So it's good that women are recognised as missionaries these days, isn't it? Yes. So they came here actually to Malton when Carey was about 23.
Okay.
They were quite pleased to see a little Baptist meeting house, the other side of this wall. We'll go in and have a look at it in a minute, though it looks rather different today. Because they'd become, they were both Christians and they'd become Baptists as well. You can see Carey being baptised there in the river in Northampton. He walked into Northampton one October morning at 6 o'clock in the morning and was baptised in the river. And that's when he really became a Baptist by conviction. Do you practice believers' baptism?
Baptism.
Yes.
So how old was he then?
He was 21 then. He'd already joined a dissenting meeting house, which was all the people who weren't Church of England. But he became increasingly convinced of believers' baptism. Even though he was baptised as an infant, he believed that this was an act of obedience to God. And I think it was pretty important to him really, because he felt that whatever God asked him to do, he must do. He promised at his baptism. And it led him to all sorts of problems, but joy as well.
So he worked as a cobbler in the same place?
He came here because there was a cobbler's cottage for rent, and you'll see why it's a cobbler's cottage when we go in there. But the church here was in very low water. The building was in a bad state, and the people were drifting away. And the previous minister had died quite a long time before, it was his daughter, I think, I've got no evidence for this, but she lived in a little cottage somewhere here where we are now. And I think she knew William Carey, she knew he'd become a lay preacher, and she thought, what we need is some young people in this church, you know, and she knew this cottage was up for rent, and I think, you know, she had ulterior motives in saying, why don't you come and rent this cottage? She knew that they needed a fresh start, and I think it was she who probably persuaded them to come and told them that this was, you know, available to rent, and it worked. Because while he was here, they asked him if he would preach for them to start with, and he'd become a lay preacher. And he said yes, he would give them his free Sundays. And then they said, oh, we wish you'd be our minister. And he said, oh, I've had such a poor education. You know, I can't think, I've never thought of being a minister. But he was fortunate to have an education at all, because being brought up in this little village, you know, there was just one charity school with just a few places for children. But then his dad got the job of being the teacher there, so he was entitled to a free place. But his dad was really a weaver, so he wasn't really a teacher, but I guess he was an intelligent man, and a man that the village trusted, so he was appointed to the job of school teacher. But he did learn to read and write, and that was the important thing. And what he also learned about living in this tiny little village in Paulsbury, in that first panel, was he fell in love with the world of nature.
Yeah.
And his sister said that whenever he went out, he would always take a long time, because he was always looking at everything, what flowers were growing, what stage they were at, were they setting seed yet, you know, what the birds were doing, were they building nests, and had they got eggs up in there, all that sort of thing. And so by carefully observing, he was really laying the foundations for becoming the famous scientist that he became. Did you know he was a scientist? He wrote lots of science textbooks and things. And eventually, when they opened SHARE University, he became one of the first professors. And he was teaching astronomy, and you know, he had a geology collection, and he was really a polymath. He was so inquisitive, you know, that he was self-taught. So he fell in love with the world of nature, but he also fell in love with the world out there, you know, because he loved to hear stories of faraway places, and he thought, you know, the way the world was so diverse was just so interesting. And his Uncle Peter, who was digging with a spade in that first picture, he'd come back from Canada, and he was just entranced by all the stories he was telling. You know, he couldn't get enough of his traveller's tales. And actually at school, other children nicknamed him Columbus. Because I think he was always going on about other parts of the world, you know. And I think he thought that being an explorer must be the best thing ever. So you see how God was preparing him.
Yeah.
And one other way he was preparing him was that falling in love with flowers in particular, wanting to know all the names, he came across a Latin vocabulary, 60 pages of Latin words, when he was just 12. And he learnt them all in order to understand the Latin names of plants. Not very usual for a 12-year-old boy, is it, to do that? And you see how he was laying the foundations for becoming a linguist eventually. And I mean, he did end up, you know, translating the Bible into 6 Indian languages, parts of it into 29 more, with the help of his friends. So the childhood was a real preparation for what God had in store for him in the future, really. And when he was just 14, he became apprenticed as a shoemaker and moved house into a little village called Piddington, and Hackleton. They were very close together, and that's where he went through a bit of a rebellious change, you know, away from parental control and everything. But there was a fellow apprentice there who would want to engage him about Christian faith and also about churchmanship and, you know, dissenting churches versus the Anglican Church. He went along to the Church of England when he felt like it. He felt he could be free now to do just what he wanted. And then when he was 17, and this, you know, they used to have arguments, and this lad always felt that Carey was winning the arguments, but really his conscience was becoming quite troubled. And then he was found out in a lie when he was 17 about a coin that he'd spent and really belonged to his master, and he tried to pass it off as a false coin. He was, prayed to God, please don't let it be discovered. I'll never do anything like this again. Please, if you just let me, you know, get away with it. And he didn't get away with it, and he was discovered, and he was so ashamed. Fortunately, his master let him off. He could have been quite severe with him legally, but he let him off. And next time he went to this fellow apprentice, took him along to the meeting house, and when he heard this preacher preach, he was convicted and gave in and became a Christian in his own right. Yes. And that was a turning point for him, of course.
At the age of 70.
Yes, yes.
And then
he became a lay preacher, you know.
Lay preacher, and at the age of 21 he took water baptism.
Yes, and then a year and a half later he came here, but just as a shoemaker, but also he was intending to have a little group of school children in his cottage. That's why you see the round table there, because he heard that the village schoolmaster had left. I think this lady must have told him that as well, because he'd already tried his hand at teaching, because they were very, very poor in Hackleton. They were really in trouble financially, so I think they came here for a fresh start. So he was making shoes, and he managed to get an employer in Kettering, which is about 14 miles or so away, to commission him to make boots for him. It was all done in cottages in those days, shoemaking, no factories or anything like that.
So it's a very profitable business that time.
Well, it was profitable for the boss, I think.
Yeah.
But no, you had to work hard. And they were always very poor while they were here. But he was doing that, and he was teaching children. And then, you know, they were saying, be our minister. So he went off to Oney, quite near your neck of the woods. And an older Baptist minister there said, join us here, preach for us, and we'll tell you if we think you're good enough to be a Baptist minister. And the answer was no. So he was turned down. But he was told that he could try again if he wanted to the next year. Well, in the meantime, he became the virtual minister here, but not officially. And he might not have been good enough for Oney, but he was good enough for this little chapel. And in fact, lots of people started coming and finding faith here as well. So much so that when he did become a minister eventually, he was able to persuade the church, it's time we rebuilt this church and perhaps extend it a bit, make it a bit bigger because of all these new people who are coming. And so that's what he managed to do. And I'll show you in the museum the letter he took with him when he was asking people for money to support. And he got £100 in the end, which was enough to rebuild. So really, we're quite grateful to William Carey because, you know, I think this church would have died otherwise because it was dying. But we're still here, as long as God wants it here.
Amen.
Yes. So he was actually quite busy here of some of those things, all those jobs he was doing. But also 3 little boys were born here to Dorothy. They'd lost a child before they came here, but 3 children were born here in the space of 4 years. So I hope that means they were both busy. I'm sure Dorothy was very busy. And he created a wonderful garden while he was here, which is what he did wherever he went. And, you know, he visited in the village, and, hello, love. And a little brother waiting for his dancing sister. And also from Kerala. I asked him, I had a chat with his dad. And rebuilding the church, of course.
Yeah.
Among other things. And there was smallpox in the village, and he was visiting the sick. And so it was quite busy here. And he was thinking, if I'm going to be a minister, I must improve my education. I told you about Latin starting. In Hackleton, Piddington, he'd started learning New Testament Greek because he'd found commentaries on the self. What was this funny writing? And so when people came in to buy boots and shoes from him who'd had a classical education, he would ask them questions. And there was somebody back home who'd had a classical education too. He would go and visit him when he was back in Paulsbury. And so he'd started teaching himself New Testament Greek just from, you know, in that way. I must learn Hebrew if I'm going to be a minister, he thought, so I can read the Old Testament. So he was working on Hebrew. Mustn't stop at dead languages. So he was teaching himself French and Italian and Dutch.
Started with Latin, then going to Greek, and then
so there were 6 languages that he was
Hebrew,
working on.
French,
I don't know.
Italian.
He must have been gifted with a lot of energy,
Yeah.
I think. I wish I had
Especially
a bit
with-
more of that. Yes. So, yeah, he really was quite busy. And one of the people in Birmingham who he was asking for money to rebuild this church said to him, because he wasn't just talking about the church to people, a big vision came in this place. What about the rest of the world? The more he looked at that globe, the more he looked at a map that he'd made for the children he was teaching. He was thinking, what has the Christian church done all these years since Jesus said, go into all the world and preach the gospel? At a minister's meeting, he'd raised this question. And he said, you know, Jesus promised to be with them to the end of the age. Well, we're not there yet. So doesn't the command apply to us today too? Sit down, young man. When God wants to convert the heathen, he'll do it without consulting you or me, said one of the elderly ministers at the time. Hyper-Calvinism. But the idea wouldn't go away. And so I think probably most of his sermons were probably, brought this in about the need to share the treasure of the gospel that was theirs. And so this man in Birmingham says, well, yes, I'll give you some money for rebuilding your chapel, but write down your ideas about world mission, then people will take them seriously. Me? Write a book? When I've had such a poor education, he said. If you can't do it as you want to do it as you're able, said this man, which was good advice, wasn't it? And so while he was here, he started writing a book, The Enquiry. I don't know whether you've heard of it.
Right.
You have, yes.
So he wrote it in his 20s.
Yes. He started it here, and a lot of it was connected with the map that you'll see on the wall, all the statistics he collected about the world and what the church had done or failed to do in different places. But yes, he started it here and he finished it when he moved to Leicester. We've got a picture of his cottage here that he moved to in Leicester. This is him preaching and studying here. But in Leicester, that little cottage there, it was a very formative period for him. From living in little villages, he was now in a big town. And he met all sorts of highly intelligent people. And he had an intellectual feast, really, in Leicester. And he got involved in all sorts of things like care of the mentally ill, improving the care, especially in the abolition of slavery. He'd been interested in that, I think, from a boy, really, because John Newton was the vicar of Oney, which wasn't very far from Paulsbury, and I'm sure he would have loved all his stories about being a ship's captain, you know, and visiting different parts of the world, and he would have shared Newton's abhorrence of slavery, that he became, you know, gradually Newton. John Newton, Amazing Grace, do you know? Yeah. You know, gradually he came to realise how horrific slavery was.
So during those days, slavery was here in UK.
Oh, we were very culpable, you know. We had an enormous part to play in the slave trade. So we would send ships to West Africa, buy slaves for beads and things, and take them all the way to the West Indies and come back to this country. And it would all start again. It was a triangle. So we were very much to blame for a lot of the the slavery in the West Indies. It's yes, and I think just lately we've become more aware of, you know, how our whole economy was based on this terrible trade in human beings. Yes, it's a real scar on England, I think. But Carey was passionate abolitionist, and I'm rather pleased that I'm fairly sure that at this church, when he was minister, he would tell people, we're going to boycott sugar because sugar is the product of slave labour, and we're going to fight against slavery. So I'm quite pleased that, you know, the church at the time in this country was quite involved with investing in the slave trade. But I'm quite glad that our church wasn't, and that they were fighting for abolition. I think the dissenters were more anti-slavery than, you know, the Church of England, who just accepted it as part of life and a good investment for their money, shamefully. Anyway. So he met people like that in Leicester as well. William Wilberforce, I don't know whether you know that name, but he was a famous abolitionist in this country and a member of Parliament, and he worked hard in Parliament to have it abolished. So it was a very fruitful time. And then his book was ready to be published, and he'd been given the money to publish it, so he did. And then he was invited to speak at very important Baptist meetings in Nottingham. And many of them ministers from as far away as London up to Nottingham, the whole area, Baptist ministers were going to Nottingham for their assembly and church representatives. And he was invited to preach. I think because he was now an author, probably. And he preached his famous sermon, expect great things from God, attempt great things for God.
Oh, he preached there?
Yes, he preached in Nottingham to these Baptist ministers and church representatives. And he preached on Isaiah 54 verse 2 about making your tent bigger, strengthening the stakes. And afterwards, people were saying, oh, that was a good sermon, Mr. Carey. And then they were going to change the subject, as people often do, having said what a good sermon is, don't they? And Andrew Fuller, the minister at Kettering, was standing there. He tugged his sleeve and said, "Sir, is still nothing going to be done?" you know, for about 7 years he'd been talking about these ideas to such people, and they were just going to change the subject. So Fuller thought for a minute and said, well, in 6 months' time we're meeting in my church in Kettering. We'll see if we can do something at that meeting. And so they met in this house in Kettering, which is still there. It's now an old people's home, but it's still there. It's got a plaque outside it. And a dozen men sat round the table and said, yes, we'll do it. We'll form a society. Wonderful. Carey's dream seemed to be coming true. Now, he had always dreamed of going to the South Sea Islands because he'd read Captain Cook's adventures.
South Sea Islands.
The South Sea Islands, yes. You know, north of America there, you know, those, yes. Because Captain Cook had been there and he'd read his journals and he'd thought, if only these people knew how much God loved them and wanted to love one another, they wouldn't be eating one another, eating their enemies. There wouldn't be all this conflict, all this poverty. They need the Christian gospel. So he'd set his heart and he'd learned so much about these South Sea Islands. But then, when this little group were meeting in Kettering, at subsequent meetings, a man asked if he could come along called John Thomas. Now that's a name to reckon with, isn't it? But not the John Thomas that you know. Anyway, he came along and said, you know, it's India that needs Christian missionaries, and I'd be happy to go there if somebody would come with me. I've been a ship's doctor, I've worked in Bengal, and I'd like to go there if somebody would come with me. How cheap is the cost of living in India, says Carey. Oh, it's so cheap. Markets are wonderful, you know, buying from the market. Nobody needs to go hungry in India. How easy is it for a foreigner to get a job in India? Oh, jobs are so plentiful. No need to be unemployed in India. Oh, no, jobs are so plentiful. At which point, Carey said, well, perhaps I could volunteer then to go with you. Nobody questioned his judgment, of course. And so this man, John Thomas, came and gave him the biggest hug. And the committee said, well, that's decided then. India it is. So that's how the Baptist Missionary Society, you know, started work in India. And then he had to go home and tell his church, who were very upset to lose him. And more importantly, he had to tell...
Here?
Not here, no, he's in Leicester now. And more importantly, he had to go and tell Dorothy, who was expecting another child. Well, I couldn't come with you, could I? And you've told me all these stories about tigers and crocodiles and poisonous snakes living in India. If you go without me, you'll never come back. Oh, so she was very against it. And it must have been a very difficult time. But eventually she realized how important it was to him, how he believed it was God calling him to go. And so she gave in, and they made a plan that he would go for 3 years, make a home, take their eldest son with them, and in 3 years' time he would come back, and then the child would be 3 years old, and then perhaps she would be willing to go when there was a home to go to. It was probably quite a sensible idea, really, but it wasn't how it turned out. Because John Thomas and Carey were waiting for a ship to take them to India, and there was a lot of reluctance. The East India Committee, the East India Company, colonial times, of course, were saying, we don't want Christian missionaries in India. They might upset native people, and they might upset our trade and our governance. So they were very against missionaries going. And so it was really quite difficult to get a boat to take them. And in the end, it was a Danish ship that took them. Anyway, the baby was born, and that was exciting. And Carey heard this news, and he writes a letter to Dorothy, and we have the letter in the cottage. We have the original letter, yes. Rather wonderfully, anyway. I think it's our...
So he started his journey in which year?
He's not gone yet. He's not gone yet. He's waiting for the boat. Yeah. He started it in 1792 and arrived in India June 1993. But he's not there yet because he's...
At that time he was in London?
Well, he was in Leicester. And they'd gone to the Isle of Wight, ready to catch this ship. But they were finding it difficult to get a ship to take them. So the baby is born
in Isle of Wight.
Yes, and the baby is born. Dorothy has come back to this area to live with her sister.
So then he came to know about the birth of the child.
Yes, she must have sent him a letter, or somebody must.
He wrote a letter from Isle of Wight.
No, so he wrote to her.
Yeah.
And he said, "Oh, so glad to hear of your safe delivery. And please tell me what you've called our dear little child. Oh, if I had all the world, I would gladly give it all to be with you and my dear children, but I could not turn back without guilt on my soul." It shows how much he loved her, doesn't it? But it also shows that he felt he had to put God first. So he chats in this letter, and I'll give you a transcript of the letter if you'd like one. He says to John Thomas, "Do you think we could go back and see the baby, see Dorothy? Perhaps now she might be willing to go." So they come back to Piddington, and the answer is still no. How could I take this little scrap on a big boat, sailing boat? And so there's a second goodbye, and Carey is so distressed at having said goodbye a second time that John Thomas says, "I'm having one more try." Into the house he goes. Don't know what he said, but it ended up with Kitty saying, the sister, saying, "All right, if it makes a difference, Dorothy, I'll come with you." So Dorothy gives in and says, "All right, we'll all go." And that's why you can see this little party standing waiting to get onto this ship. Dorothy and baby Jabez and Felix and William and Peter, the three that were born here in Malton, and her sister Kitty, who's not married, and Carey. I don't know where John Thomas is, but he had a habit of disappearing anyway. 5 months voyage to get to India.
5 months voyage.
5 months voyage.
So she was having
this baby on board the ship, for 5 months, and they were blown off course to South America, shipwrecked going round the Cape of Good Hope. Mast was broken, but eventually they limped not that side of India, but this side, of course, up the Hooghly River near Calcutta, and they'd arrived at last. And do you think Carey was wasting his time on board ship? No. He was learning Bengali, of course, wasn't he, from John Thomas? And he said, "Let's begin translating Genesis into Bengali. And on a Sunday, let's invite people in for a service in my cabin." And, various other things. So he was quite busy. And I think he was quite sanguine about all these things going wrong with the ship and everything. He had a great belief in the providence of God. God will sort it out for us. I'm not quite sure that the women would have felt quite the same way. Especially not with a tiny baby to look after. And the boys probably thought it was a big adventure, hopefully. Anyway, they arrive in India and Carey gives the money that has been given them, that is to last a year, to John Thomas to look after. Big mistake. Big mistake. He's hopeless with money. Carey should have known better. But he spoke Bengal so fluently and knew how to barter at marketplaces and all that sort of thing. He had the savoir-faire, so all given to John Thomas, and he'd blown it all within about a month. And they were homeless. And they were given a dilapidated garden house to live in. And once again, I don't think the women in the party would have been very pleased. I bet they had an ear bashing, those men. John Thomas disappeared, as he frequently did. Nobody knew where he was. And so they somehow managed, I don't know how, no money. But then they heard that there was a salt master living in the Sundarban area, and that's now Bangladesh, isn't it? The Sundarbans, yes. Who had left the house and they could have it rent-free for 6 months. Wonderful. Everything packed into a boat, off they went, to Debatter, I think it was. And I think Carey was in his element there because it was rural, and there were new flowers to see, new animals. And yes, there were crocodiles and there were tigers who ate a few people each year. And yes, there were poisonous snakes in the garden, but fortunately they survived. And more than that, the saltmaster was still in residence actually. He hadn't left, in fact. But he was a bachelor and he said, "Oh, this is a big house. You're welcome to stay here while you build your own house." So they stayed with this hospitable salt merchant. And now Carey was getting quite able in Bengali and he was able to chat to people in the village and tell people about Jesus. And he was getting on with building their own home. And everything was fine until a message came from John Thomas to say, "I found you a good job up north in Munnabati, it's in an indigo plantation creating purple dye, and it's well paid, and the manager's a Christian, and you'll have plenty of time because the work is seasonal. You'll have plenty of time for language study and translation work." So it was a no-brainer. Everything went into the boat again, a very long journey up north, always by river, of course, in those days. But Kitty, the sister, had fallen in love with the salt merchant. And she said, "Well, I'm staying and I'm going to marry him." So poor Dorothy lost her sister at that point. I don't know whether she ever saw her again, really.
So this salt
merchant, yes.
He was a white man?
Yes. And salt was an important commodity in those days, of course. Yeah. And so they stayed put and got married. And Carey and Dorothy and the children went up north.
Which place?
Well, it was called Munnabati in those days. I don't know whether I'm pronouncing it correctly. I'm not sure what it's probably got a more modern name, hasn't it? I must find out. I will try. I know it was quite far north of Calcutta. And so there, for the first time in his life, he was quite well off. So he was able to invest in building a church and a school. And then he heard the wonderful news that more missionaries were coming. So he bought another plantation that belonged to him that would fund the work of the mission. And he started building houses. But before that, they had some very lonely years together. And one of the bad things that happened was that baby Peter died.
Peter died.
of fever, yes. Their middle son that was born, no, their youngest son who was born here. He wasn't as young as Jabez, of course. So that was a tremendous sadness, and dear Dorothy was getting progressively more suffering from mental illness and depressed. So it was a very sad time in many ways.
So that mental illness caused because of Peter's death?
No, I think
No.
that just made it worse. I think it was probably happening already, yes. But then one of the new missionaries arrived, and he was allowed to come and see Carey. So he travelled to Mudnabati and said, "We can't come to join you, you know, because this is English ruled territory, and they might be putting up with you being here, but they're not prepared to have any more Christian missionaries in this place. Will you come to Serampore and join us so that we can found a mission in that area, because that's under Danish rule, and the Danes are much more sympathetic towards world mission, Christian mission." So it was a no-brainer. He had to do it, but he lost a lot of money. He had to leave the church and the school in the hands of other Christians, nearby European Christians. No Indian converts. He was beginning to feel a bit of a failure by this time. You know, sometimes he would have preached to as many as 500 people, and they were all very polite and smiled a lot, but no one was willing to commit to Christian faith. So he was beginning to feel quite a failure as an evangelist. Perhaps my job is just to prepare the way for Indian evangelists who will do a much better job. So you know, the church was largely European that he'd founded, in fact. So off they went to Serampore, and that was a wonderful decision, because there they founded this wonderful Christian community, and just a handful of them to start with, where they lived very simply, but all used their skills to make money. Carey's primary task was translation work, and he'd got a printer who joined them, and he'd been given a printing press, so they were able to open the mission press at Serampore and get on with translation work. And the Danes were very hospitable. And I told you that this lady, Hannah, opened girls' schools, boarding schools for making money, Bengali girls' schools, pioneering female education. Her husband was a teacher too, opened boarding schools for European boys that was fee-paying, and free schools for Bengali boys. So they were starting to get on, and they were starting to make money. And then, joy of joy, you know, the first Indian convert, Krishna Pal, said, "I believe and I would like to be baptized." And there he is being baptized in the River Hooghly. And I'm sorry, the artist didn't put in Felix as well, because their eldest son was baptized at the same time. They were baptized together, Krishna Pal and Felix. And that was a very joyful day. And it was indeed the beginning of the indigenous Christian church in that part of India. And lots of suffering to go through, lots of persecution. The Hindus in particular were very antagonistic, and Muslims too. But somehow they got through it all and flourished. And it wasn't long before Carey was saying, "Well, now let's spread out. Let's form mission posts that will become Christian churches in time." And so mixtures of Indian evangelists and Europeans sort of went to different mission stations and started missionary work there. And we've got, I'll give you a copy of the Serampore Covenant. which was a way in which they reminded themselves 4 times a year what they were there for. You know, colonial types were there to make money out of India, really. And they were distancing themselves with this. They were there to be good for India. Let's remind ourselves, we'll read this covenant 4 times a year. We're all equal in the sight of God. And, you know, let us not put any obstacles in the way, any cultural obstacles in the way of Indians to become Christians. I think one big obstacle was the fact that when they met for communion, you know, they all had to sit round a table and eat together, whether you were a Brahmin or you know, lower castes. And this must have been very difficult. He refused to accept caste. We're all equally important in the sight of God. That must have been tough for those first Christians too, I think. Mind you, a lot of them came from the Dalit class to start with, because it was real liberation for them. Anyway, and I'll give you one of those in a minute. And so, you know, this equality thing was very big in Carey's mind, and it meant he could hobnob with governor generals and important people and not feel, oh, little me, I'm just a cobbler from England sort of thing, I can't talk to him, you know. And I think it was God's sense of humour that gave him a very well-paid job in Calcutta, part-time job. It was the East India Company who were founding a college called Fort William in Calcutta. And they were wanting the young men, the posh young men from this country who were going to take up office in the English administration in India. They were wanting them to learn Indian languages and about Indian culture. And they scoured the expatriate community for a good Anglican who was respectable enough to be a professor in their college. And they couldn't find an Anglican. All they could find was William Carey. And so they asked him to become professor of Indian languages and culture in this college, where all these posh young kids from this country were coming to this, you know, and they were going to, well, they didn't immediately call him professor, but eventually they had to give in and call him professor, who was a Baptist. And you know, an uneducated Baptist at that, charity school upbringing, never been inside a university in his life, and here he was, you know, kids from Harrow and Eton and Oxford and Cambridge. So I think that's God's sense of humour. And he did it for a long time and got a very good income. And people in this country didn't understand him doing a secular job like this. But wow, he had quite a powerful influence on these young men, you know. One young man came to him one day and said, "Sir, what do you think I should do? I've inherited plantations in the West Indies." I told you they were posh kids. Slave plantations, of course. So Carey looked at him and said, "Well, don't you think you should go and free your slaves?" "I'll catch the next boat," said this man, and off he went, you know. So, you know, he was having that sort of, he was still concerned about slavery in the West Indies, even though he was living in India, one world. In later on, when these young men were in different provinces and cities of India, they would write to Serampore and said, "Have you got any missionaries who could come? We really need some Christian missionaries in this part of India." You know, so that was his influence as well, I think. And I think while he was there, he would hold at-homes where people could come and discuss problems with him. I think he felt better at doing that, you know, helping people in their Christian faith than he felt as an evangelist, really. Although he was an evangelist and he did, you know, people did come to faith through him. But anyway, let me just tell you one other story, because once he went into the church that he founded in Calcutta, in the poorest area of Calcutta, as it was called then, of course. I know it's Kolkata now, isn't it? One of the poorest areas, the Dockland areas of Calcutta. And he went into the pulpit, and what did he find hanging there but a pair of leather sandals? And he knew what they meant, because of course only the Dalits would have been leather workers. And they were saying to him, and he knew this, you call yourself a professor, you hobnob with governor generals and the like, you live in a lovely house here, who do you think you are? We know who you are, you're just a leather worker. So he took the sandals and he waved them in the air and he says, yes, I'm just a cobbler from England. And if God can use a person like me, he can use all of us.
Amen.
Yeah. So there's St Paul College there at the top there. That was their crowning educational glory, really, because it was the first university in Asia, you know, able to confer degrees by royal decree. It was brought in line with the standards of Denmark's universities, and they taught all subjects. And yes, the idea was that Christian young people should be well-rounded, you know, well-educated leaders, church leaders. But it was open to people of all faiths and from people beyond their borders too. And I know in Kerala at the moment there are still people doing work with St Paul University. Well, it's college now, it's called a college, part of Kolkata University. But celebrated its bicentenary a few years
But
ago.
the theological university is still.
Oh yes, it still teaches theology.
The other
Yeah.
degrees are under Calcutta University.
I think Calcutta, they give the degrees.
Yes. But the theological degree, Sarambur University is still.
I think they have all sorts of other lower qualifications too, don't they? I think that you can do by through. I think they do they endorse things from colleges elsewhere in Kerala, for instance. I think, don't they?
They
no, they don't.
affiliated, we say affiliated to separate universities.
Yeah, the other colleges, the theological colleges are affiliated to Sarambur University.
Oh yes.
So they give, this university gives degrees
Right.
all over
Over
India.
it.
Does it still? Yes,
Still,
even though
still,
it's
still.
Yeah.
even though it's
It's
connected
valued.
with
All over,
Kolkata.
all
It's
over,
valued.
all over India.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that is, they give BD, they give
Yes.
bachelors in divinity, masters in
Right.
divinity.
Yes. And they've got quite high standards, I think.
Yes.
And a fortnight's time, I've got a professor from St Paul University who came to me as in 2016 as a Hindu PhD student doing a PhD on William Carey, and he's now a lecturer, and he's just had an exchange with a university in Austria, and he's coming to stay with me for a couple of nights, and he wants to return to this place for the things he might have missed, you know, when he was here last time. He's sort of travelling in different parts of so I've still got sort of connections with these people, really. I'm a bit awed, actually, of him staying with me again. I don't think he realises, you know, I'm quite an old lady now. Anyway, and botany, of course, followed him all through his life. Calcutta Gardens, botanical gardens there, and he founded the Agri-Horticultural Society of India as well. Anyway, I've done enough talking, haven't I? I'm sorry about that. I do. You look so interested that I kept.
Yeah, we are so interested and recorded everything so that we can use it in India.
Please take a bookmark, and this is the letter. If you'd like a copy of the transcript of the letter, I'll show you the real thing in there. And this is the St Paul Covenant. And then we'll go and have there's a book, chargeable book there. Pardon? Oh yes, right. He made a globe, for teaching geography, I'm sure, and trying to enthuse people with the wonderful world. And he made it with different coloured leathers that
Well,
he had.
this is the original one?
But no, I'm afraid not. This is a reconstruction.
Reconstruction.
We've got no, I mean, she's drawn a picture of it there, but we don't know what the original was like. But we do know that he used different coloured leathers for different land masses. So hopefully it's a bit like that. But a very skilled leather craftsman made this for us. Yeah, I'll tell you that when we go in the cottage anyway. But we've used it as a tool for getting people to think about refugees and, as being one world, and no borders on that, no writing on it. How does God see the world? That was the idea.